Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nai-Kyung Lee. I'm a professor of political science, international relations at Seoul National University, and I'm really honored to be moderating this session. So today, we're standing at a turning point with global power shifting, the climate crisis intensifying, and AI transforming every aspect of life. So our session takes up this fundamental question of how do we address these challenges? So to tackle these issues, we have great scholars of the century. So we're honored to welcome two of the most renowned scholars whose work have really shaped global debates on why some nations fail while others succeed. So let me first introduce Professor Jared Diamond, who's a professor of geography and physiology at UCLA. He's a Pulitzer-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and many other best-selling books, translated in many languages. And here, Professor James Robinson, who's a university professor at Chicago, and was awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics in Science on Research on Institution and Prosperity. So we'll explore 5 topics throughout this discussion: AI, climate, geopolitics, the role of different actors, and Korea's experience. So let's dive into these questions. So to start off, let's turn to the questions related to AI. So the recent development, which is advent of AI, is shaping our society everywhere. So what is your view on how AI is shaping our society? On one hand, it's creating opportunities for growth and problem solving, but on the other hand, it is creating problems and creating new challenges. What makes differences as to whether society will benefit or suffer from this new technological development, and how should we address this going forward? So we'll first hear from Professor Diamond, and we'll go to Professor Lawrenson. And if disagreement arises, I'll reconcile. And if there needs to be a clarification, I'll ask for a clarification. Thank you very much.
All a few decades younger than I know about the benefits of AI. My 38-year-old sons, will explain to you that I can only tell you about the disadvantages of AI. And I will mention 3 that I've seen, serious ones that I've seen in recent years. First, in teaching UCLA undergraduates, within the last couple of years, our students have turned in essays overwhelmingly written by AI. American students were already losing the ability to write, and now their ability to write has crashed even further because they are not writing. Problem number 1. Problem number 2, in the most recent course that I taught at UCLA in the spring, we asked each of 16 students to give a short oral presentation of 5 minutes. And I was shocked to see that of the 16 students, 15 read. They were incapable of ad-libbing a presentation. They read a presentation that had obviously been written by AI. So students have lost the ability to talk spontaneously, but that means that they've lost the ability to persuade people in the business world, and they've also losing the ability to persuade partners to marry them and to conduct a fruitful relationship. And then finally, the week before last, both Nature magazine and Science magazine, the major weeklies, had articles on the explosion of fraudulent science articles produced by AI. Each year now, there are about 3,000 new journals turning out tens of thousands of articles, and a large fraction, maybe more than half those articles, are fake articles generated by AI, in some fields more than others, especially in cancer research, biomedicine, and molecular biology. Jim, can you say something good about AI, please?
Well, yes. For me, leaving aside the sort of science fiction of AGI and all of that, if you think about it as a technological revolution, and you think of it in terms of past technological revolutions, you sort of say 2 things. Think about the Industrial Revolution or the spread or diffusion of computers. On the one hand, they raise productivity, not as much as you'd expect, computers never raised productivity as much as you'd expect. If you looked at the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the factory system, mechanization of production, steam power in the late 18th, early 19th century, and you looked at the numbers on productivity growth, it's sort of there, but it's modest. So, it's less than, it's more than its detractors say, but it's less than its kind of, boosters say. So I think, there'll be clear productivity benefits. But as in all of those examples, there's big distributional consequences. So the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, mechanization put skilled workers out of business. In England, they became known as the Luddites, who went around smashing machines because they were unemployed. The spread of computers, we now understand has had a kind of tectonic effect on wages and employment in the United States. Computers were very complementary with college-educated and skilled workers. So I think AI is also going to have big distributional effects. What's interesting is it's not clear how they're going to go at the moment, because AI might also displace a lot of college-educated and skilled workers. So computers were somehow very complementary. So in those previous revolutions, it was sort of clear who was going to suffer distributionally. I don't think it's actually quite clear at the moment who's going to suffer distributionally from the spread of AI. And that's a puzzle at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that. So Professor Diamond, do you have something to add to that related to this distributional consequences of AI, or how we might be able to address that? Or is there any way to address it, given that AI benefits certain people or a certain society, whereas it actually creates disadvantage for a certain society? Is there any way out, or do we have to just embrace it?
I have nothing to add to Jim's clear forecast of problems whose solution is not clear.
Yeah. I think there's different ways of addressing it. And I think, but a lot of the instruments you have depend on the sort of model of capitalism that you have. In some sense, the diffusion of computers in the United States has caused so many social and political problems because of the model of capitalism we have in the United States, which says, you can't provide social insurance to help these people. In Sweden, you have a very different model of capitalism, which gives you a lot more instruments for helping people adjust to these changes. In the early 19th century, of course, you didn't have redistributive instruments to deal with these problems. You sent out the militia or whatever. But I do think a lot of it has to do with the legitimacy of the institutional structure also. You can cope with a lot of distributional change if people think what's happening is happening in a kind of proper and legitimate way.
I could just add to that now. Thinking back on the negative consequences that I mentioned, there are ways to address those negative consequences, and we're already trying to do them at the university, but we haven't figured out how best to do it. For example, for students turning in papers that are generated by machines rather than themselves, one thing that we're doing in exams is that students have to handwrite exams in blue books. We don't permit students to do computer-generated exams. Similarly, in terms of students giving talks, we can require students to give spontaneous talks. We can say you may not give the talk with notes. I recall that when I was in high school, each of us in the class was required to give a spontaneous talk on a subject that was announced 30 seconds before he gave the talk. And I remember a classmate of mine was asked to give a talk on it is better to eat peas with a spoon than with a knife. And my poor classmate was tongue-struck. He couldn't think of anything useful to say, but nevertheless, he learned his lesson. He went on to become a communications officer at General Motors, where he was very successful. So I think that frightening experience shaped him up.
Thank you for a very fruitful discussion. So let's move on to the second topic that we prepared, which is climate change. So when societies face climate change, as you two have both kind of described in your books, some adapt and some even innovate while others collapse, right? So what explains these differences, and what kind of lesson can we gain from these experiences in really thinking about how to address climate change crisis in today's world?
I'll have two things to say about that. And the first short thing is that my field work is on the island of New Guinea in tropical jungle. Things are always going wrong there. And so I've learned to adopt an attitude that I call constructive paranoia. I'm paranoid, I think of everything that could go wrong, but a constructive paranoia, I try to benefit from it. There are nations that practice constructive paranoia. A prime example is Finland, the Scandinavian country of Finland. Finland was attacked by Russia on November 30, 1939. The Finns preserved their independence at the cost of 100,000 dead Finns. And the lesson that the Finns learned is that since the Second World War, every month the government of Finland has a constructive paranoia meeting. That's to say, each month they have a group of experts, one of them is a friend of mine, whose job it is to think of what might go wrong this month with the banking system, this month with the electric system, this month with the product system. So they think of everything that could go wrong, and they prepare for it. The result was that when COVID broke out, the Finns had thought about a pandemic 2 years previously, and the Finns had stored something like 300,000 face masks. So the Finns, because they're prepared for everything that could go wrong, were prepared for COVID.
I'm not sure I've studied climate crisis, but I think, what Professor Diamond is saying, I completely agree with, which is there's lots of different sorts of crisis, and probably your ability to respond to one is very similar to your ability to respond to another. I always like the example of South Korea and South Vietnam. So what's the difference between South Korea and South Vietnam? Well, they both face these sort of existential threats from North Korea and North Vietnam. South Vietnam failed miserably, and South Korea succeeded. Why was that? Well, I think because South Korea was able to develop a kind of collective project. It was able to develop a sort of cohesion and a sense that there was a goal that they were all kind of working towards, and they were able to kind of get behind that goal. And South Vietnam was never able to do that. They disagreed. There was cleavages within the society with regard to the North, and the whole legitimacy of the government of the South. So I think a lot of it has to do with that ability to work cohesively and sort of define priorities, the way Professor Diamond is talking about. It seems to me to be successful in this climate space, the biggest problem is it's just not visceral enough, the problem. It's too nebulous, the climate problem. So, if I was working in that space, it seems part of this is a sort of communications issue. Like, how do we make that so visceral to people, that they're going to pay attention to it, and that you can actually build a sort of collective project around that. So I think that's to do with, why was South Korea able to do that? To do with the legitimacy of the institutions, to do with the social capital in the society.
Professor Diamond, do you have something to add to that?
I would like to add one more thing, that the issue of climate change is an example of a crisis, and nations face all sorts of crises, such as the crisis, Jim, that you just mentioned. My wife is a clinical psychologist. There's a branch of clinical psychology called crisis therapy, which consists not of helping people with long-term problems by seeing them 3 times a week for years, but it's for dealing with someone who has a sudden crisis, someone whose marriage broke up, someone who was just given a diagnosis of cancer, someone whose mother just died. It's something that makes them doubt that their way of coping with life has worked at all. And it turns out that in crisis therapy, you have about 6 weeks to either to figure out a new way of dealing with life problems, or you revert to your old, non-adaptive way. Well, in crisis therapy, there are lessons for how to get through a personal crisis that also apply to national crises. The first lesson is you have to acknowledge that there's a crisis. The United States, for a long time, did not acknowledge that we had a crisis. Secondly, you have to acknowledge that you have responsibility for dealing with the crisis. You can't blame those other bad people. The United States had an unfortunate tendency to blame Canada and Mexico and not recognize the bad things that it was doing. In a crisis, a personal crisis, as in a national crisis, you have to distinguish between the things about you or your country that are working perfectly well and the things that need changing. In a crisis, personal as well as national, you can learn from other people. You can get help from other people. You can look at other nations that have solved the crisis. For example, Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan is a wonderful example of a country that learned by looking at how Germany was doing it and how England was doing it and the United States and figuring out what worked best for the Japanese. So in short, for dealing with crises like climate crises, national crises, there's a lot that we can learn. There's a lot that I've learned by looking at how individuals deal with personal crises.
Professor Robinson, do you have anything to add to that, or? Okay, so it seems like both scholars agree that it's important to set priorities straight, and we need to acknowledge that it's a problem and really drive lessons to tackle the issues. But one problem is that, you know, in certain countries, environmental problem is not recognized or acknowledged as like a existential crisis. So where do we start in thinking about acknowledging that climate crisis is a real issue that we have to, you know, deal with, or we have to, you know, prepare for? Because it seems like from your discussion, preparing for environmental crisis starts from acknowledging the problem.
I mean, I think in the United States, you know, you have to somehow depoliticize it. If you look at survey data on whether or not people think there is a climate crisis, then there's an enormous bifurcation between, you know, different political sides, Democrats, Republicans, you know, but that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This is just a scientific question. It's just a matter of evidence. It shouldn't make any difference what your politics is. So somehow this got wrapped up, you know, in this political polarization in the United States. So the first thing that needs to be done is to somehow disentangle this issue. You know, this is not about left or right or Republican. This is about the society, you know, collectively. And I think that somehow has to get across. I mean, a wonderful historical example is from the Netherlands. You know, that the Netherlands, most of the Netherlands is actually below sea level. And the Netherlands, when it emerged, you know, in the early modern period, was able to build all these collective polders, these dams, these earthworks to kind of make the country secure from flooding. And one thing which is interesting about that, you know, relevant to the discussion here, is everybody worked together. Why is that? Well, because if there was a flood, everyone drowns. You know, elites drowned, rich drowned, non-elites, poor people, they all drowned. Doesn't matter. You can't save yourself from a flood. So somehow it was an issue which really was existential for everyone, and they had to work together. And you'd think, well, the climate crisis looks like the same sort of problem. You know, no one can insulate themselves from that. So I think if one could communicate that and in a way that would depoliticize it, that would go a long way to, you know, having some objective notion of what the evidence is.
I would just add to that the best teacher is not us communicating, but the best teacher is what climate itself is doing to us. For example, last summer, the American city of Phoenix, the temperature never dropped below 45 degrees centigrade for a month in Phoenix. 45 degrees centigrade at 6 a.m. at dawn. And in the daylight, the temperature was 50 degrees centigrade for a month nonstop. That meant that people walking on the sidewalk in thin shoes, their feet got burnt on the sidewalk. That was a lesson to people in Phoenix. We in California, in Los Angeles, you undoubtedly know about the fires in Los Angeles. We should have been forewarned. We had 2 straight wet years that made large-scale growth of green vegetation. Green vegetation doesn't burn, but there was a lot of it. And then in the 3rd year, we had a very dry year. So all that green vegetation then became dry and was subject to burning. And then on January 7th, there were strong winds, so fires spread in Los Angeles. You undoubtedly saw the pictures. Large parts of LA look like Hamburg and Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. 20,000 houses were burned. I have dozens and dozens of friends who lost everything in the fires. Well, that taught LA a lesson, and I hope it will teach other Americans a lesson, but if it doesn't, then Americans are going to learn the way that Americans learned at Phoenix. Their feet are going to burn when they step on the sidewalk, and eventually they will have to connect it to burning fossil fuels, despite our current government.
So let's move on to the next important topic, which is changing climate politics and landscape. So it seems like now in today's shifting global order, a lot is happening. A lot of uncertainty, power struggles, changing alliances, and competition over resources. And amidst these uncertainties, some countries are growing stronger, whereas some countries are growing weaker or declining. So, how can we explain these differences? And in a world where power seems to dominate, can weak or middle power countries still protect their interest and find some room to maneuver in this sense?
There are strong countries and there are weak countries. There is a lot that can be learned from history. The greatest historian was the Greek historian Thucydides, 2,400 years ago. His history of the Peloponnesian War is still worth reading because humans are humans, and Thucydides is gripping. One of the most terrifying passages in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War concerns a strong state and a weak state. It's called the Melian Dialogue. The dialogue on the Greek island of Melos, a small island that was threatened by the powerful Athenian Empire. The citizens of Melos were not prepared for the demands made by Athens. The Athenians visited Melos and said, "We want you to do such and such and cooperate with the Athenian Empire." The citizens of Melos said, "That will make you look badly in the eyes of humanity." Well, that was not an argument to take with the Athenians. And the terrifying end of the Melian Dialogue is that the Melians refused to accept the Athenian demands, and the dialogue ends by Thucydides saying, "And so the Athenians conquered Melos, and they killed every man, and they sold all the women and children into slavery." That's an extreme example of what can happen with a strong country and a weak country. When the weak country has not anticipated and dealt with a strong country. I mentioned the example of Finland. Finland learned from its experience with Russia. Finland with a population then of 3 million, Russia with a population of 150 million. After World War II, the Finns made a point that every year the president of Finland visited the president of Russia, and constantly every month government bureaucrats at every level talked with the corresponding Russian bureaucrats. The result was that the Finns convinced the Russians that the Russians had no surprises to fear from Finland, which the Russians had felt at the outset of World War II. The Finns went to a big effort to anticipate the concerns of the Russians. Today, with the tragic war between the Ukraine and Russia, I don't know what the Ukraine did or failed to do before the war with Russia, but I have to wonder whether there was anything that the Ukrainians could have done to anticipate. For example, whether they could have made clear that they were not going to join NATO, that they would get much more harm from joining NATO than if they permitted talk about joining NATO, whether the Ukrainians, by talking constantly with the Russians, as the Finns did, whether the Ukrainians could have staved off their fate.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have grown up during the Cold War, so I'm I'm always a little surprised when people think suddenly there's this world where power relations are important. And, I remember, the Russians invading Afghanistan and everybody manipulating every African country, the war in Angola. Actually, I remember the United States invading Afghanistan and Iraq pretty recently. And so my view is that power relations have always sort of driven the world. And, in some sense, we've lived through this very bizarre period, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Professor Fukuyama's End of History, sort of imagining that we've sort of gone through this phase transition and everything is going to be different. And I never believed that for a second. And now we're all sort of waking up, it seems to me, and remembering, dusting off our copy of Thucydides and Tolstoy. You were mentioning, Professor Diamond was mentioning Tolstoy earlier, and kind of re-engaging with this. So I think we're back to that sort of reality. And, I think if you look back at that reality, there's always been power politics. Could be the Soviet Union, could be NATO, United States, could be, go back, could be, my own country, Britain, that used to have this global empire. We were endlessly invading countries and annexing them and fighting wars. And so that, I think that's been the sort of the history of the world. And I think, within that history, embedded within that history, if you look at it, there are all sorts of opportunities for small countries to flourish. South Korea, I was mentioning earlier, flourished, despite being sandwiched between North Korea and communist China, and, Taiwan flourished despite the ever-present threat of invasion, from mainland China. And I think you see around the world many countries flourished in niches, you could say, in this system, maybe niches in this system. But I think South Korea wasn't really in a niche even. It was right in the forefront of this. And still it hatched this remarkable, successful kind of project. So obviously, terrible things can happen, in this world driven by power politics. Terrible things could happen. That doesn't stop countries flourishing despite, these such difficult circumstances.
Jim, you've inspired me with another thought. This is what some small countries have done in the modern world with great success, so that they are important productively, or they're important as examples, far out of proportion to their population. The small countries that I'm thinking of include, of course, Finland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Israel. You would be surprised to know that I think the Netherlands, that tiny country of 16 million people, is the second largest agricultural producer and exporter in the world. Why? Because the Dutch learned to build towers 100 stories high, and they don't have just one crop on the ground, they have towers, enormously productive. So the Netherlands are a major agricultural producer. Israel, with highly educated citizens, productive and creative, far out of proportion to its numbers.
So let's move on to the final question, which is related to where we are right now and where this conference is held, South Korea. So let's have this conversation sort of closer to home and think about Korea's role and how it should perform on global stage. So as you've mentioned, Korea achieved remarkable success despite limited natural resource and despite being surrounded by sort of powerful countries such as China and Russia. So what lessons can we learn from Korea's experience? And which lessons are most relevant for other countries? Like, how can other countries learn from Korea to be, successful or develop into middle power or, I guess, developed country?
As a frequent visitor to Korea, I've been here. This is about my 8th or 10th visit, and I come here because I enjoy the country, I enjoy Koreans, and I admire Korea. What are the things that I admire about Korea? Your population is highly educated. You get value out of your population. Korea has demonstrated again and again in the last 150 years the ability to survive adversity. Just think what Korea has gone through that the United States has not gone through. You've been occupied for, 45 years. Your schools were not taught in your Korean language. Your schools were taught in a completely different language, Japanese. After World War II, Korea was not a highly industrialized country. You began to industrialize so that within decades, Korea rose from a relatively poor country that had come out of occupation to a first world country. Korea has demonstrated patience. You've put up with so much in the last 50 years. One of the predictors of people dealing with crises and of nations dealing with crises is that usually neither people facing a divorce or a death or another crisis, nor nations, when a crisis arrives, usually you don't solve it successfully the first time. You have to try again and again. But a country that doesn't have a track record of success gets discouraged and gives up. Korea does have a track record for, what is it now, 115 years. You've gone through the most awful crises, worse than anything that the United States has gone through. So those are reasons why other countries can look at Korea and can take inspiration from Korea's success. Jim?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, I was going to say that a couple of years ago I had dinner in Bogota in Colombia in South America with a bunch of the biggest business tycoons in Colombia. And I'm very critical of the situation in Colombia. If you've read my books, you know I'm very critical of the situation in Colombia. And they all tried to convince me that, no, Colombia was a great success story. Look at Guatemala, you know, like we could be like Guatemala. And I said, no, you shouldn't compare yourself to Guatemala. You should compare yourself to Korea, because Korea shows what is possible. It shows what is possible in a country if you invest in education, if you just believe in yourself and you just throw everything at transforming the society. So I think it just shows like what is possible. And that's just extraordinary to me. If you think about, you could replicate the Korean experience in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the poor countries of the world, in the Philippines, it would be just extraordinary. So I think South Korea should get out there and blow its trumpet, you know, about what happened in this country. It's remarkable, and focus on how you did it and what you did. Maybe the details are not so important. You know, every country grows in its own way and specializes in different economic activities. I don't think it's about creating a Colombian Hyundai or creating a Colombian Samsung or whatever. But I just think that sense of possibility and kind of setting the bar is very important, actually, for galvanizing kind of projects, developing projects in countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that insight. So I have one follow-up question. So I've been talking to my American friends and European friends, and one thing that I hear often is that you know, they're surprised or they're mesmerized by how resilient Korea's democracy is. So since both of you have talked about institution and the role of institution, and then coping with crisis in your books, so how do you view like, why is it that like some institutions are more sort of resilient versus like others? Like, can we get some lessons or some insights from you so that we can shed light on the Korean experience, but also experiences by other countries?
Well, you know, I tend to think that democracy is a bit like agriculture. It was invented independently in different parts of the world it wasn't just invented by the Greeks. It was invented by the Greeks, but it was invented by people independently in the Central Valley of Mexico, in Africa, in East Asia, I think if you look at the kind of deep history of the species, I think like what we know about Homo sapiens is that it was almost certainly much more egalitarian than our nearest primate relatives. Something about the emergence of Homo sapiens from chimpanzees created a much more egalitarian type of society. There's no alpha males or silverbacks I tend to think of, democracy as being something which comes naturally, to humans all over the world. But I think, what you see in Korea is that it's been spectacularly successful, democracy. It's not that, but sometimes democracy emerges in very challenging contexts, like in Latin America, for example. Democracy emerged in the 1990s, recently, but it emerged in the context of very weak state institutions which couldn't achieve much, very sort of clientelistic type of politics. And then people get disillusioned. But I think what you've seen in Korea is democracy emerged in the late 1980s. Well, you could say there was democracy in the 1950s or whatever, but democracy kind of re-emerged in the late 1980s in the context where state institutions could deliver for people, could achieve things, where politics was much less clientelistic than it was in Latin America. So people see the fruits of democracy and they're willing to sort of fight for it, not just for kind of deep ancestral reasons, but also they understand the benefits that it's brought to this society. I think, my mother used to say, credit where credit's due. And I think, if one looks at, economic policies in this country in the 1960s and 1970s, for example, under President Park, there were successes. There were definite successes. But for me, it's impossible to imagine the kind of explosion of creativity that you have in this country now without that transition to democracy.
Something that I would add goes back to the parallel that I'm always aware of being married to a clinical psychologist. I see a parallel between success of a democracy and success of a marriage. If a young couple who's about to be married, get married, asks me, what do we need for a successful marriage? I will answer, you need 37 things to get right. It's not enough to get right about sex and children and money and religion. There are 33 other things. You got to get all 37 right or your marriage is doomed. But the other thing I would say is that you don't set up a successful marriage and then you coast along happily for the next 50 years. Marriage requires constant work. Things come up. There are new issues. Each person changes. I'm now 88. I married Marie when I was 45 years old. Marie is a different person now from when I met her. I met Marie when she had just turned 30. Marie is now about to turn 77. Marie is a different person. She's gone through a different life. I'm a different person now. So marriage requires constant work, even after 50 years. It's the same way with democracy. The United States founded a democracy in 1776. And yes, there were issues with our democracy. We've constantly struggled on those issues. We broadened the categories of citizens to whom democracy applied. We fought a civil war. In our civil war, more Americans were killed in our civil war than in all other wars put together. The latest studies show that the death toll in our civil war was 800,000. That's far greater than in World War I, plus World War II, plus Vietnam, plus Korea. One would think that from 1776 till now, 2025, the United States has learned how to operate a democracy, and we don't have any problems doing it. We know how to do it. All you have to do is to open the newspaper any day or to spend 1 hour any day in the United States, or to turn on the television, or to have a conversation with my wife or my children, you know that democracy in the United States is in severe difficulties now. Jim and I were talking about this over breakfast. It's uncertain to me whether the United States will still be a functional democracy in December 2026. What this illustrates is that democracies have to be worked on. You don't just set them up, but they require constant work, just as do marriages.
Thank you for your insight. So we're out of time, so we're coming to the end of our session. But before we end our session, let's give a round of applause to Professor Diamond and Professor Robinson.